My name is Gorman, and in this episode of Semilla.VC, I sat down with Chris Dowd. Chris works on the investment team at Dalus Capital and was a Fulbright Scholar in Mexico City. Prior to moving to Mexico City, Chris worked at Google in a number of different positions, including as a Strategic Partnership Development Manager, a Google.org Fellow, and as a Global Affairs Analyst. He was also an intern in the Executive Office of the President of the United States in the White House. In this episode of Semilla.VC, we discussed AgTech and mining in Latin America, especially Chile's recent move to nationalize lithium production. What it was like for Chris to start a restaurant in Mexico City, why elite Latin American technology operators are founding climate tech startups, and the geopolitical and global security need for climate tech innovation. We discussed all this and more in this episode of Semilla.VC. Okay, Chris, could you start by telling the audience a little bit more about your work history up to and including your investment thesis around climate tech in Latin America?
Sure thing. Well, first of all, Trip, thank you so much for having me. Super excited to be on the show. So a little bit about my personal journey. I grew up in the U.S. In Washington, D.C. Mom was a journalist, and my dad was in the shipping business. So we had a very kind of international conversation around the dinner table. For that reason, I went on and was, really interested in foreign affairs, studied international economics and security in undergrad. In the summers, I spent a lot of my time working on political campaigns, thinking, I wanted to spend my career in DC. So I went and was working in the Obama administration and really caught a bug there and absolutely loved it. But at the end of the day, I knew that I had a growing interest in the private sector as well. So after college, I moved to San Francisco and was at Google for about 4 years. Initially was working for the chief legal officer for Google Maps at the time when everything was really kicking off around GDPR. My later roles were more focused on product and business development. So I helped launch a program through the AI Impact Challenge at Google.org, where we're using Google's core geospatial infrastructure and cloud infrastructure and AI infrastructure to produce public data sets around asset level emissions. And then I was leading strategy and partnerships for Google Search around sustainability and crisis response. So that's everything from on Google Search, when you search certain technical terms around scientific methods in the climate change space, or you even want to understand what's the quickest way to get somewhere without having your vehicle loitering too much on Google Maps. So a lot of different services that when you have a base of 1 billion plus users, small tweaks can go a long way. In that post, I had a global team and a global perspective, but at the end of the day, my butt was in a seat in San Francisco, and I felt that I wanted to have some international experience for myself. So I decided to pursue, a long-term dream of doing a Fulbright after, being inspired by my brother who had done one 10 years earlier. And a year later, I was in Mexico doing my Fulbright scholarship and also working at Dalus Capital. So that brings me to our thesis a little bit. And, what do we do at Dalus and what do we focus on and what do you think is important? To give a little background, Dalus is almost 10 years old. The founders, Diego Sabristi and Rogelio de los Santos, this metaphor doesn't go so far talking to my Latin American colleagues, but if there is a Mount Rushmore of venture capital, they would be on it in Latin America. We focus on seed through Series B companies writing checks from $500,000 up to $6 million US. And really the key thing for us is finding founder market fit, really trying to understand what is that unique, actionable insight that a founder can take to an industry to be disruptive. I spend most of my time working on our climate thesis. The core questions there for me are: one, is this company scalable? Is it repeatable? Is it technically and from a drawdown perspective efficacious and sound? And is venture capital really the right mechanism for this kind of project? Right? There are some situations where yes, this solution, maybe it's a refinery for lithium, needs to exist to improve the decarbonization opportunity for that industry, but it might not be a VC backable business. So really balancing those dynamics and recognizing that we're a software first fund, and so we're looking for those sorts of opportunities.
Amazing.
The last thing I'll mention there is, from a climate perspective, in Latin America, we don't expect that people are willing to pay green premiums. So we have to be smart about the companies we invest in, and do they fit into a consumer or business's everyday operation in life and make their life easier, especially in a macro context like today where things are expensive and businesses are cutting down and there isn't as much leeway to support emerging ESG initiatives. So they really need to fit with the bottom line of pocketbooks and balance sheets.
I appreciate that foundation. You mentioned the Fulbright. I'd love to hear about, your experience in that program, and then you were paired with Dalus, which seems like you won the lottery there. I'd love to hear about your experience in that program and how that really brought you into VC.
Great thing. So as I mentioned, 10 years ago now, I was in India visiting my brother who was a Fulbright Scholar there. And I was just so inspired by the community that he was surrounded with. These characters come from all walks of life, all disciplines, and are really just brought together by the idea that cultural and diplomatic exchange is a powerful tie that pulls countries together. And the program was, came out of World War II peace initiatives, right? Where we want to help young people connect across cultures and across languages. So that piece has really stuck with me at a young age. So when I arrived to Mexico as a Fulbrighter, I was really excited because my thesis around being in Mexico was the fact that, the U.S. and Mexico relationship is not going anywhere. It is very deep, economically, culturally, politically, linguistically, artistically, right? There's an incredible book called Vanishing Frontiers, which really sort of set my sights on Mexico, trying to understand the ways that our two countries really have to work together and be deeply connected. And so when you start to think about venture capital as a mechanism for scaling great ideas, was no better place in my mind than to be with Dalus. So I started off, in a sort of part-time basis with the team. And when my Fulbright was over, I came on full-time in the investment team. And I was inspired by the fact that they're really at the cutting edge and had a really strong thesis around our companies need to be regional. They need to have an impact outside of their specific country. And the U.S.-Mexico relationship is a deep place for these companies to flourish.
You mentioned traveling to India and then realizing something. You did a whole trip around Latin America and you learned a bunch of other stuff. I'd love to hear about where you went on that trip, what you learned, the big takeaways. Tell us all about that.
For sure. So yeah, I mean, the first question is, I guess, why did I do it? I think a similar itch that I had when I was at Google, I was having at one point when I was at Dalus, where I said, I'm loving this job and I'm loving this work, but the reality is that I'm sitting here in Mexico City talking to founders from countries I've never been, where I have no sense of the cultural pretext. I have no sense of the real deep things that drive the innovation ecosystem. And to think that Latin America is just sort of a monolith that you can invest in and support founders across the continent, I think is a fool's errand. So I really wanted to go, and I recognize that this trip didn't result in me being an expert in any way, but just the small things that you pick up, sitting around a table with founders in Santiago, or visiting a lithium mine in northern Chile, or sitting and hosting a happy hour with Barn Investments in Sao Paulo, right? Your learning is doubled and tripled. And the things that people share with you in person, but might not share with you on Zoom, right? You get to really, really get proximate to the things that are driving these ecosystems forward. So I took 6 weeks. I went to Bogota, Medellin, Sao Paulo, Santiago, Montevideo, and Buenos Aires. In each of those places, I hosted small events, ran around the city, meeting with founders, with VCs, with institutional capital, to really try to understand, what makes this place tick, and who are the heroes of this industry, and what are the regulatory fears that people have, who are the industrial incumbents that everyone wants to have as a B2B customer, right? So all of that pretext, where if you arrive on a 45-minute pitch with a founder, you'll just never get it. And as an investor, that's key. And I think it's important also for our portfolio companies that we have in those countries to just meet with that and say, hey, yeah, we have our Zoom monthly, we check in, but I'm actually here and let's talk, and would love to meet your family, and all that sort of stuff, right? It really matters. So it was an incredible trip, and I would recommend anyone that is investing in Latin America to make a similar trip, right? It's I think we're doing ourselves a disservice by not being really proximate to the problems these founders are trying to solve.
You mentioned the lithium mine. I think that must be an incredible trip. I'm hoping to make it out to a lithium mine once in my life as well. But you've written about mining, you've written about ag tech. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you're seeing in those spaces in Latin America right now?
Absolutely. So yeah, maybe we'll just start with the mining piece. So a few things. Like I think look at the U.S., look at Europe. The commitments that are made from a corporate perspective, from a government perspective, and decarbonization are once in a generation. And there's one thing which is to say what you're going to do, and then there's another thing to actually have the providers and the capacity to make these kinds of transitions. Let's just start with batteries. There's critical inputs to battery electrification in the United States that don't exist domestically and rely heavily on trade relationships. So I'm really interested in the way that Latin America and the lithium triangle, you call it in South America, are going to play a real outsized role in expanding their supply to support decarbonization efforts in the U.S. and Europe. Seen some numbers around the fact that capacity of the last 20 years is going to need to double in the next 5 years for critical minerals in Latin America. So part of that, has last 2 weeks ago that Chile has nationalized their lithium industry. And I think part of that and some of the other sort of macro movements you're seeing in the level of investment, the level of new discovery that's happening, there's a huge transition. And any time that there's a transition of that scale and speed, there's an opportunity for technology to play a role. Whether it's hiring and vetting talent that works in the mining industry and having marketplaces for talent to work on these mines, to using AI and machine learning to improve discovery rates. A company out of Chile is really advanced on this called Mineral Forecast. Or if it's just understanding the marketplace and the value chain, right? How this product is going to from the ground to a battery manufacturing Tesla plant in Monterrey, right? These are very big transitions that are happening. I think technology is going to have a huge responsibility in accelerating them, and also making sure that we don't end up in a situation where 30 years from now we're looking back on a generation of human rights errors, of serious environmental degradation, right? There's an opportunity and there's a consciousness to get ahead of this, right? And so the tools and the solutions need to be there before these mines are being built. So that's an area I'm super excited about. You mentioned ag tech as well. Few of the sort of dynamics in the ag tech space that I think are super important to kind of pin down and really drive the exciting investment opportunities. One is very sophisticated industrial incumbents, right? The Driscolls and Monsantos of the world. They all have operations in South America. Cargill, very, very sophisticated enterprise customers, enterprise partners. Two, really rich ecosystem of VCs that specialize in ag tech. So Yield Lab, SP Ventures, to name a few. These are funds that have deep expertise. Their LPs reflect those industry incumbents. And they can speak to a broader audience of investors and say, we vouch for this technically. We understand the market better than anyone. And that gives a level of confidence of later stage capital. So that's super, super important. And then just look at the macro environment, right? We have the United States, for example, 94% of agricultural production is concentrated among seven producers. In Latin America, it is much more distributed. You have smallholder farms producing a lot more of the bounty per region. And I think with that, you have just a huge opportunity to create solutions to improve their operations, to improve their access to capital, to improve their yields, and share best practices across these many smaller operations.
You mentioned Boric's plan to nationalize the lithium production in Chile. I mean, from my perspective, it's unclear if that's a good move or a bad move. I think you have a million times more insight on that. So is that something that, are they going down the right track with that or the wrong path?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think history might dictate in South America specifically that the nationalization of industries has been a short-term boom for private producers and private regional players, but have been long-term disruptive to the maturity of the industry and their ability to work effectively with international players and be a part of the global value chain. I'm optimistic about the Chile experience. I think they have a very sophisticated incumbent mining industry. I've been close with some of the founders on the ground there building solutions, and they also are optimistic, especially for homegrown entrepreneurship, to support it. And look, the reality is that there are intervening industrial players from around the world who are coming and setting up shop and intending to set up shop in Chile. And I think if you're Chilean, you're getting calls from your domestic providers and saying, "Hey, we can do this. Give us a chance." So I think it makes the competitive bidding process a little bit more localized, which I think is going to be good for the local producers. I think what remains to be seen is how is this going to impact production. At the end of the day, that's what really matters. How efficiently can these licenses be given, and can the supply side be increased in an ethical and effective way. So just 2 weeks hot off the press. I'm having 1 or 2 calls a week talking to folks about this, but let's see.
Amazing. I appreciate that very good answer, even though it was only 2 weeks old. I have a question, and I think the audience might like this answer. What is your favorite restaurant in Mexico City?
My favorite trip. Great question. So it's a restaurant that I just opened, wine bar with some of my closest friends here in Mexico City. It's called NIV. It's in La Condesa. So we're a wine bar, but we have small platillos that we also serve. And really, the motivation for this project is kind of twofold. One was always having friends that work in the hospitality industry and in the wine industry, and just really falling in love with that work in my personal life, and always wondering if that was something that I could do. So we got together with a few friends with really diverse backgrounds, from an architect to a designer to a sommelier, and we built this concept, which is really driven by kind of 1 or 2 ideas, right? One is that we want to have this be a place where the top creatives in Mexico City can see as part of their portfolio. So what does that mean? We had partnerships with Costaya, which is one of the most coolest emerging fashion brands. Patricia did all of our uniforms. Worked with a brand called Xpan, which does bespoke speaker design for our listeners in the back. We had Hotel, which is a friend of mine who started a great plants business. He curated all of our outdoor plants, right? So the idea that this space can be somewhere where these creatives see it's their own, right? And they come and they create the plants, and that's our community. And then the other is just offering a place that you can come for a great glass of wine and great plate that you might not find anywhere else. So one of our partners runs a wholesale wine importer called Climax, and so he has access to wines that have been covered in dust for 100 years, and offering that to customers and seeing them smile on their face when they get to try for the first time has been a super joy. So I hope you'll come sometime soon.
It's amazing. Well, I'm looking forward to the upcoming time that I will get to go, so I'm excited about that. I want to ask a very broad question, and I'd love to see where you take this one. What are you most excited about right now?
Yeah. So a lot of things. Two things work related that I'll mention. So one is our Catalyst program, which we've been building for a number of years with the GIZ, which is one of the development agencies of Germany, and Tec de Monterrey, which MIT of Mexico is one of the most elite engineering universities in the world, to seed and support with non-dilutive capital, pre-seed and early stage climate-oriented startups in Latin America. So, we talk a lot about ecosystems. We talk a lot about different stages of capital raises. And I think we identified some number of years ago that this sort of pre-institutional capital, pre-product market fit space is ripe for supporting early stage entrepreneurs, right? So that program is coming online later this year, and it's an incredible multinational collaboration between an incredible university, a development agency, a venture capital firm, and many other players along the way. I'm super excited for that program to come online and see how that encourages more founders in the space, and younger founders. And the other piece that I'm really excited about is, even in just the year and a half that that I've been with Dalus here in Mexico City, started to observe this trend around truly elite founders in Latin America choosing their next bet to be in the climate innovation space. And I think that says a ton about where the puck is going. So Sebastian Morales, for example, one of the co-founders of Clappy, has since launched Via Energy, which is an energy retailing service based out of Colombia. That's a guy that could have done a lot of things after he left Rappi. And he chose to do that. And of course, there's a commercial opportunity there, certainly, but there's a massive impact opportunity as well. So seeing that is really, really inspiring. That some of that former CFO of Nubank has since launched Momback, which is a platform to improve the quality of offsets and forestry carbon drawdown in Brazil. Again, somebody that could have done a lot of things chose to do that. Jack Zeri from Vamo in Brazil, launching battery swapping electric motorcycle service to support the over 5 million moto boys across Latin America. We're delivering iFood and Rappis all across the continent, right? Again, a guy that could have done a lot of things and chose to do that. So many more examples I could mention there. But that gives me a lot of inspiration and excitement about this ecosystem, and specifically this climate ecosystem. They're going to have a great breakout success. They're going to gain the attention from international funds, early stage founders. They're going to chart the path for this region. So I'm really excited about that.
Chris, I want to ask one last climate tech question and then bring it to the finale. But I'd like to ask, how is climate tech in Latin America different from climate tech in the US and Europe?
Certainly. So first and foremost is regulatory support. You could say that regulatory is a carrot or a stick, but in the US with the IRA, you have the US government playing referee, customer, and supplier. It is one of the largest, the IRA is one of the largest, checks out one of the largest injections of capital from the government to support a specific innovation sector in almost 40 years. And where public capital goes, private capital quickly follows. So that is going to be a huge transition for the US and Europe, is calling suit. And I think in Europe, you have a higher level of consumer and enterprise consciousness around climate. And that's huge. They are at the frontier of supporting emerging technologies. For them, direct air capture was a thing in the 2010s, right? They're talking about phytomining and, very, very emergent themes and products and technologies there. And when I look at Latin America, the challenge is that you don't have the same level of regulatory and government support around subsidies, around R&D support, around regulatory encouragement. I think, a lot of people have spoken to a lot of people about how Mexico has limited regulatory intervention over the last couple of years, really sort of hamstrung the renewable energy ecosystem. So it's a more complicated environment, and there are less tee-ups, I would say, that you see in Europe and the US. But also there are just massive opportunities if you can make things not trick people at green premium and create technologies that are highly scalable and localized to the problems that people are trying to solve. So I'll give you a specific example here. Quilimo is a two-sided marketplace water offsets platform based here in Mexico, with one of their biggest customers being Coca-Cola in northern Mexico. So sure, people have read that Monterrey experienced a day zero last year, which is terrifying, lack of potable water. And what Quilimo is doing is brilliant. Within a single watershed, they are encouraging smallholder farmers to be more efficient with their water usage, and then with that savings, selling offsets to major corporates, Coca-Cola, for example. And that sort of local solution, which was obviously built in the context of these kinds of cities with large industries such as Monterrey, but also within a single watershed, they have agriculture, right? it was a unique solution to that problem, but it's highly scalable and will be repeatable across Latin America and in other regions. So I think we have to look for those sorts of opportunities here where the solution is not going to come from anyone else, but it will benefit everyone else. There's a great course at Stanford called Designing for Extreme Environments, and I think that this is a great example, right? And there are many of those across the region that I get excited about, and I see where they can be scaled and brought to other parts of the world as well, and leapfrog in many ways some of the learnings and sort of headwinds that technologists and entrepreneurs have faced in Europe and the US.
Amazing. Okay, so finally, I have to ask Peter Thiel's famous contrarian question with a uniquely Semilla.VC twist. What important truth about Latin America do very few people agree with you on?
So I'll return to the mining space. So I take foreign affairs in school, and I've always been interested in these kinds of topics. So imagine a situation where China invades Taiwan in the next 3 or 4 years. The U.S. Attempts to intervene militarily in the South China Sea, and we end up in a situation where China, with a single phone call, could say, we're eliminating the export of cobalt from the DRC. We are and refining services, of which they are a leader worldwide, is limited to only those that are allied with the Chinese government. Say goodbye to your net zero commitments. Say goodbye to battery electrification goals. That will put Tesla, General Motors, the biggest car manufacturers OEMs into its serious bind. And that's just thinking about auto, right? There are so many places where those inputs are critical to the production, right? And critical to the underpinnings of the US economy. So what I would say, which maybe most people wouldn't believe in, is that the next 5 years are the most important years for the Americas to come together from a diplomatic and economic and trade perspective. And I'm not talking about just the USMCA. I'm talking about multilateral relationships between the US and South America, whether it's Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, these major producers of minerals. And this is a strategic and geopolitical risk, if not. So I think I will be shocked if that isn't top priority for the U.S. State Department in the coming years, for these, for the Chilean government, how they're thinking about nationalizing the industry and deciding how are they going to cut up the pie of production, to who and when, because I think it poses a serious risk to Western democracy. So that's something I think in the next 5 years we're going to see heat up tremendously.
Wow. Okay, Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the Semilla.VC podcast today. I very much appreciate your time.
Sure. Thank you so much, man. See you soon.
Thank you for watching this episode of Semilla.VC. Make sure to like and subscribe wherever you view the podcast. Follow me on Twitter @GormanTrip. And be sure to check out our newsletter, Dealflow LA, which can be found by going to dealflow.la.